Thank you, Ranch. And now, Kairos Shen is the Chief Planner of the Boston Redevelopment Authority. And I just ask all of our panelists to please come up front. And thank you, Kairos, for moderating.
So I think the first order of business is to have us make further introductions. You've already heard I'm the Chief City Planner for Boston. I'm also the Director of Planning for the Boston Redevelopment Authority. Worked there for 20 years. I was either the first hire of Mayor Menino or the last hire of Mayor Flynn, so depending on how you count it. So, Nicole?
I'm Nicole Fichera. I think you've heard a little bit of my story already, but my background's in architecture originally. I worked for Haseen and Associates. I was on the design team for this building and worked with Boston Global Investors on some of the early Innovation District kind of positioning, and then that led into a role working with the Boston Redevelopment Authority as the Innovation District Manager, which was absolutely fascinating, amazing experience, and very recently I transitioned over here back to the building. I'm now the general manager here at District Hall, working for the Venture Café Foundation. So it's been a sort of complicated route circling all around the same place.
Good morning, my name is Travis Sheridan. I'm on staff at the St. Louis County, or St. Louis Economic Development Partnership. We just recently merged with the city, so we're changing our name. Rebranding is always fun when you're trying to remember who you work for. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about what we've done in St. Louis with regard to creating innovation districts. I'll also bring in some of my experiences that I have from California. I'm one of these few people that thought it was better to not be in California and actually be in St. Louis, because the entrepreneurial spirit was better and more alive in the Midwest than it was in that state out to the west. And so I'll talk about some of the experiences that I've had out in Fresno, California, which is very much like St. Louis. It's the flyover country of California.
Hi, my name is Paul Parkhil. I'm the executive director of an organization called Spaceworks, which is a nonprofit that develops affordable workspace for artists in New York City. It's a relatively new organization. It was created a couple of years ago by the Department of Cultural Affairs in New York, really to address systemic affordability issues facing artists around the city. I think I will also talk a little bit about the job that I had before this, which was at an organization called the Greenpoint Manufacturing and Design Center, which developed space for small manufacturers and artisans, and I think it's kind of a continuum between the two jobs.
Thank you. Charles Reid. I'm with Boston Global Investors. I'm head of design and construction. I've been working, I guess, 5 years now, Kairos, on starting from, this was a rail yard. If you see, please see a picture of this when it started. We're the major developer of 26 acres. We have Mr. Fallon's group, which is another larger developer, another large over here, but I think this was a dream. I don't know how long you were working on it before, probably 20 years, Kairos, on this one. But this is a dream for the innovation zone of Boston. We've been very happy to work with them, and it's been a slow couple of years, tough couple of years, but things are really taking off. You can see Vertex across the way in Fallon's group, and we are working on B&C, which is a major, major retail center, but I think it's a good test case of where you take an old area of rail yards, like in New York, with the rail yards going up there, and you develop it, and I hope it'll be helpful, some of the hints we've done and some of the steps we've taken.
So we're going to start today. The format is that each of us will give a 5-minute kind of introduction, elaborating on our introductions. And then afterwards, we're going to have a moderated conversation, and then, of course, questions and answers. So what I'm going to try to do is, in 5 minutes, tell you a little bit about the story of the Innovation District here in the Seaport District in Boston. Believe it or not, it was 40-odd years worth of planning. And one of the stories about this is that as we were planning out this new area and working with the federal government and state government to get the new Silver Line, which is the dedicated bus underground busway here, which is stationed not far from here, and the new highway system and the Ted Williams Tunnel. That was 40 years ago when that planning started. We had no idea what the character of this place would be, but we knew generally the kind of build out and then the part of the city that we wanted to create here. Now, you can imagine there were a number of plans, and more recently, we were following relatively conventional planning and also economic development strategies, working with developers, having them tell us what the best land use is and what the best tenants are. And you know, one of the most amazing things that we learned in 2007, 2008 with the economic downturn was that the developer were wrong. I mean, we knew that before, but now we had proof, right? That in fact, that the most financeable and most bankable tenants were the first to disappear. And when the mayor looked around and we looked around, what was thriving were these small startup businesses throughout the city and the region. And so the question that we had raised before was that the image that the developers were providing for us was really a kind of anywhere USA, because you could get, you know, crate and barrel repeated over and over and over. I think we were fighting that, and the notion that the mayor really started to promote and we started to try to to implement about creating an innovation district started there, to try to create an area, a neighborhood that would have a special character intrinsic to the kind of strengths of the city, both the strengths of the economy that was here and the talent that is here. Now, we were also lucky because at the same time this was happening, many of you who know our region very well, Kendall Square, which is the sort of ground zero for startup and innovation in this region, got full and got expensive. And so you can't beat having good luck when you do planning, because we looked at here and all of the developers and building owners of the warehouses buildings here started to be really antsy with the economic crisis, and they were willing to work with us as a city to really begin to promote and get tenants, and were willing to sign leases that were non-conventional, and were willing to actually lease out smaller pieces of spaces in the buildings that you see. And then the city also owned an inventory of industrial buildings in the Marine Industrial Park further east. Now, so you can't beat good luck, as I said, but there's also another important ingredient, which is the leadership. I think a lot of the startup folks in Kendall Square always felt like Mayor Menino and Boston was not particularly friendly to their kinds of ideas, because, you know, when you go to MIT and Harvard and so on, the whole notion of being near the mothership was very comforting. To come over to Boston, where there isn't this kind of already a cluster of this kind of entrepreneurial activity, was tough. So the mayor, instead of using tax incentives and so on to lure people, he spent his time talking to the president of Boston University, talking to people like Tim Rowe at CIC, talking to Hockfield, President Hockfield from MIT, to really show how close this place was to the other clusters. So that's an important component. Probably the most important component was the openness and the invitation from the city that, hey, you're welcome here. The second thing is that our authority is involved in planning and developing or giving permits to developers. We were strategic at that time to think about how we would work with somebody like Charlie and his team, because they were looking for a permit for 6 million square feet. And we said, well, you've got to try to figure out how to make this thing more than, again, what I call Anywhere USA. So through the negotiation process, they agreed to invest $4.5 million at that time to building what we didn't know what it was, but we called an innovation center, which is now District Hall. And we figured by the time we get to actually unlocking the money, we would figure out what this thing would be. So they became a partner in this, and we, through our permitting authority, were able to leverage that. Now, the other thing that was also happening is that there were one Marina Park Drive across the street here was a spec office building that was under construction, and when the downturn came around, there was no tenants. So the mayor, again, worked with Joe Fallon, who's the owner and developer of that building, and at the same time, the state was starting Mass Challenge. So we were able to get Joe Fallon to provide an entire floor of office space for free. It's now in the third year in this building, in that building. And these kinds of strategic investments that were catalytic in getting people to think about this place differently were the kinds of things that the city did. The last thing we did was that we knew that the social infrastructure was maybe more important than the physical infrastructure in creating a district like this. So District Hall is part of that. The other thing is housing. And we convened all the landowners here and said, we need something innovative about housing. And what came out of it is These innovation units, the first 40 of them have been built in 63 Melcher Street, south of Summer Street. But other cities called micro units, we call innovation units. And the notion that we make a distinction there is that innovation units is not just about small. It's about creating community. The notion that you might have a small private space, but that building has to have an infrastructure of public space for the kind of social infrastructure for us to really sort of test whether the notion that people can live together and think together and create companies and economic development together. So that's the story. Of course, there's much more than that. But just to remind you, so leadership and an invitation, open invitation. Second is non-traditional economic development and leveraging with our private partners. And the third is housing. So I'll leave that. We'll come back to it later. Nicole?
Sure. Thanks, Kairos. So I'm going to follow on that, and you know, I've given a lot of Innovation District presentations over the last year and change, but I'm going to talk about something a little bit different today. We're talking about creating places for innovation, and I wanted to share with you some thoughts I've kind of built over the last few years, especially around working around this project, but also bringing people over to see Factory 63 and working with Mass Challenge about that intersection between physical and social infrastructure, or really sort of kind of physical assets in the built environment, and what that means in a much more sort of squishy way for the way that people are connecting with each other there. So, you know, I wanted to kick this off just to tell you something that is kind of like embedded in my personality since I was little. My dad has all these like isms, these things that he says over and over and over and over, and we're like, we know, and you're like, you know, he'll start the sentence and be like, the only thing, and then we have to finish it, and you know. But one of those, since I was very, very small, he always said, the only thing constant is change. And it was very annoying when I was little. It was really annoying. Like, the only thing constant is like change. I know, pie, I know. But it's really powerful, and it's something I've come back to over and over again, doing this work in the last few years after the recession, and really thinking about the next stage of the economy, that we weren't ready, you know, and if we tell ourselves that the structures that we've built, whether they're physical or non-physical, that they're going to last in their current form forever, and we build our entire world around that, we're wrong, and we're going to have really hard times all the time if we keep thinking that way. So, you know, as I'm thinking about space now, especially this building, and like Kairos said, we had no idea what this was, no idea. And it was like, you know, the city wanted an innovation center, and, you know, there was some like Harvard Business School like language about like innovation being some stuff and collaboration, and then like BGI was like, okay, we have a parcel and here's some money, and we were sitting in these conference rooms at David Hassein's office being like, okay, so it's a little bit like a library, it's a little bit like a community center, it's got something going on that's sort of T-station-ish because people are moving through and all these user groups, and we need to speak to them silently, and we don't know what's going to happen, and it could be a hackathon, it could be a conference, it could be a dance party, there could be gallery shows, there could be technology launches, there could be pop-up retail stores, and we have X amount of money and sort of a parcel and a single story to build all of that. And it was a fascinating process, and what it really forced us to do was just to be comfortable with the idea that we had no idea what was going to happen here, and to design around that somehow to make people feel comfortable no matter what they were doing. So it kind of brought up some key principles that now I return to over and over again when I'm thinking about space. And as I talk through these, I've started to really apply them to things that are non-physical as well. And so I think that the way that we think about physical space and physical assets is really translatable to the way that we think about other kind of structural interventions, whether it's a sort of tax policy or an incentive, whether it's a zoning code, whether it's a financial tool, that you can kind of use some of the same principles, because in reality, these things last a really long time, and they're going to be affecting us through lots and lots and lots of different versions of the economy that we can't anticipate. We have no way of anticipating it. So what we have to do is make them flexible, we have to make them integrated, and we have to make them aesthetic. And I'll talk through those three things and why they're important just really quickly, and then I'll wrap up and hand it over. So flexibility, that's an easy one, right? It's like a lot of different things have to kind of happen, but it's flexibility on two different time scales. One is on a day-to-day basis, and in this building, one day we have a dance party and the next day we have a very serious conference about cities, and the same space needs to be able to work for both of those. It's also flexibility really in the long term, though, that the building itself, this building is sort of a very particular thing, but if you think through the buildings in Fort Point and so much of our post-industrial built environment, they are wonderful buildings for the long term because they have good sized floors that can hold a lot of weight if you need it. They have good spacing on their column grids. They have big windows that let in a lot of daylighting. They work well whether it's housing, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's working, whether it's something in the future that we've never seen before. That initial framework works really well, so that upfront capital investment can contribute value for a long time and be flexible to all those different kinds of uses. The second thing is integrated, and that is the sort of backbone of why something can be flexible. If you think about where your systems go and the fact that you're not going to be using the same systems always to even move air around the building, and you put them in such a place that it makes sense for all the different uses around them, and you don't build so custom of just to one tenant or just to one very, very specific use, then you're going to make a building that's a lot easier to sort of change things out over time. And the third thing is a little more esoteric, and that's aesthetic. I was doing this is where I get to sound smart, ready guys? A couple of years ago, I was reading Proust when... Right, true story. I was reading Proust, and it's Swan's Way, and it's so weird. If you've ever read it, it's it's so crazy. It's just it's all over the place. And I just had this little moment where I realized something, that the word aesthetic, linguistically, is the opposite of the word anesthetic, which is fascinating because we use those words completely differently in our day-to-day life. And aesthetic is this layer of something that designers want to charge you money for, and then anesthetic is something that puts you to sleep before you get surgery, right? And it's if you look at the word, anesthetic, it's the opposite of aesthetic. And so if anesthetic is something that makes you go to sleep, then maybe aesthetic is something that makes you wake up. And it's not something that is tied to a particular style or a particular time. It has a quality of giving you energy rather than a quality of making you sort of retreat into yourself. So if our spaces can be aesthetic, that means that they can make us express the best of what's inside of us. And I think everybody's ever been in an anesthetic space, right? Like a beige classroom or a windowless office is anesthetic, and you don't want to talk, and you're sad, and you have cubicles, sad, it's terrible. So I think flexible, integrated, and aesthetic are the three words that I've come up with for thinking about space, and then also thinking about the fact that these things can be applied not just to our physical assets, which last a very, very long time, so we have a responsibility to make them contribute more value than they're contributing now, but also to our non-physical assets, so that when we're writing sort of a piece of legislature or something else that's going to last a long time, that there are principles we can use to make sure it's going to be flexible enough to respond to what we need in the future. Because the only thing constant is change.
So if I forget anything, I've preloaded most of my main comments in Twitter to go out as I'm speaking, so just a little easier that way. When I think about innovation districts and creative and innovative spaces and places, I initially want to take the romance out of it, because I don't think that innovation is really all that romantic. And I'll give you a case, and I'm not a romantic person, and here's exactly why. At one point, before I was married, my girlfriend at the time, who agreed to marry me, said to me, "Travis, you make me so happy." And my immediate response to her when she said, "Travis, you make me so happy," was, "That's not true. I created an environment in which your happiness is the most likely outcome." My wedding vows were much better than that. But when I think about innovative spaces, I think all too often we try to force creativity and force innovation, and all we can do are create spaces where entrepreneurial success and innovation really becomes the most likely outcome. And so when we can't force anything, visit my Etsy page for all my witty cards. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not giving away any cards. So here, what I want to talk about is a little bit a perspective from second-tier cities or weak market cities. St. Louis has not always been a thriving community, and I came from Fresno, and Fresno was not always a thriving community. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the perspective from those cities. I'm also going to talk about the importance of aligning innovation to authentic assets that exist within the city. I'll talk just briefly about some funding options, how we funded innovation centers both in Fresno and in St. Louis, Missouri, and some non-traditional ways to make sure that you can not only have the doors open on day one, but how do you fund things going forward. And then I'll talk a little bit about programming and why I think programming is so important. And in the midst of all that, I'll use the word density and talk about density a lot, because in each of those areas, either from funding to creating spaces, density is really important. So from the perspective of these second-tier cities or weak market cities, the things that I always want to make sure I think about when I use the term weak market city is if it's a weak market city, then there's something that can be strengthened, right? I mean, it just makes sense. And so instead of trying to, and in Fresno, the community was weak because it was an ag community, and you are, at the beck and call of nature, and things go south pretty quickly, and ag was being disrupted by technology, yet the farmers were not early adopters of technology. It's interesting that the two places where I've really tried to see a lot of innovation has been in the ag side and then municipal services side. Two of the most risk-averse industries in the world, right? Trying to get farmers to adopt early technologies. But in Fresno, water technology and agricultural technology had an opportunity there, and we saw a lot of industry that existed in Fresno. We had several multinational pump manufacturers that were headquartered in Fresno. We saw the schools that were churning out engineers in the water tech space, and so we saw these natural assets and realized that's where we could strengthen ourselves. We didn't necessarily need to move into, people would say, well, let's be the solar capital of the world because in Fresno it's sunny 300 days a year. That's not necessarily why you want to. The weather does not drive your innovation agenda. And so in that second-tier city, in that weak market city, we looked for ways that we could naturally strengthen it, and that will get me to authenticity in a moment. In St. Louis has a history of large manufacturing, and a lot of the innovation that was created or initiated in St. Louis was reactionary to drastic change. And I think that that's another thing that I think that we should really keep in mind is, as much as we like to have a crystal ball, most of the things that we do when we're creating innovative places those are reactionary efforts. In St. Louis, Chrysler laid off 43,000 people. Let's see, McDonnell Douglas and Boeing downsized, got rid of like 25,000 people. Pfizer laid off 60% of their workforce, all within the area. So we had all these talented people, we had all these people that needed jobs, and we needed to react because, for politicians, jobs are very important. And those manufacturing jobs may or may not be coming back. So how do we take these natural assets, the human assets, the talent that exists, the fact that we have industry still represented somewhat in that community, how do we use those and leverage those to move forward? And so our first incubator in St. Louis was really a reaction to the McDonnell Douglas downsizing. We received funding in order to respond to that. So I think it's really critical to look at what's going on in your environment. What are some things that are natural and authentic assets, from talent to industry to education? What exists, and how do you leverage those to really build and define your innovation center or innovation district? Because there's no need for everybody to become the next Silicon Valley. And in fact, when I was in Fresno, I did this little parallel. Fresno's water tech community started with farmers and people needing more efficient sprinklers. They needed sprinklers to work better. So it started with one problem, and then industry was built around that. In Silicon Valley, it started with one problem. How do we do something with all this silicon, and can we make microprocessors? And then let's build an entire industry around it. So identifying those problems or identifying those assets and building around it, I think, is very crucial. When I look at density, especially in centers, I think of what we did with our Helix Center. The Helix Center is our biotech incubator that I came on board to program out and run in St. Louis. The Helix Center was placed in a very strategic spot, and I liked where it was placed. Even though it's out in the county, it's not in the urban core where I like to spend my time. It is out in the county. But in the space, we have the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center, which was created about 12 years ago to allow academics to leave the laboratories at the university and actually do research and development outside of the academic structure, so that tech transfer is a little bit easier. So they have over 100 researchers doing plant science research at the Donald Danforth Center. The way that we want that to work is they would graduate, or they would finish up their work at the Danforth Center, possibly take some space at the Helix Center, which is our biotech incubator, to commercialize that science that they've been working on. They would grow out of our shared labs and our space and land in Bridge Park, which is our research park and commercial space directly across the street from us. We have shovel-ready dirt that they can then use when they need more space, and Monsanto's across the street in case there's an exit opportunity. Right? We want to create this ecosystem all within less than a quarter-mile space. In fact, I could see all the buildings and all the empty land from my office. And when you have that density, then people naturally start bumping into each other. I often use the example of, peanut butter and chocolate in the old Reese's commercials, for those of us that remember people walking around the corner and the Reese's bump into each other. That's what we need to do in the density space. Back in Fresno, with regard to density, we saw that our incubator was not facilitating that, so we actually me and a business partner created a second co-work space to create that density. Now, it was 1,800 square feet, so it was a fraction of the size of this space. It was just a tiny co-work space, but we had over 180 clients or members that were there. So about 10 per square foot, that's pretty good turnover. And the goal was to create really a gym membership for creative professionals. They come in 24/7 and can use that space, and we just wanted to create those collision points. And so as we're seeing things change in Fresno or even in St. Louis, we see that all these centers are becoming places for collision points and collision opportunities for entrepreneurs. Now let me wrap up with funding. We funded a lot of our projects, both in Fresno and in St. Louis, with EDA funding, Economic Development Administration. They are great in response to problems that exist. So in Fresno, we had 17% unemployment. We needed to create jobs. In St. Louis, we had all these layoffs. We needed to create jobs. The Economic Development Administration helped us procure a building, build out an incubator space or an innovation space, including equipment. They do not pay for day number 2. They pay for you to get the doors open. And so I think sustainability, financial sustainability is important. In Fresno, we were financially sustainable because we got the Workforce Investment Board, which is part of the Workforce Investment Act, to actually provide funding for ongoing programming that allowed us to do business plan training, to bring in mentors and pay mentors and that type of thing, hire staff. So looking for that ongoing funding is crucial. The other opportunity for funding is just from industry itself. In the water tech side, a lot of industry said, we need more innovation. Existing industry wanted to be connected to the innovation pipeline, and so they would help fund some of the programming just to be in front of the entrepreneurs. So we see a lot of these transitions, and when I look at a crowd like this, each one of you represent different communities. And I was talking, I think we were talking beforehand, and I said, if we take San Francisco and New York out of the equation, then more than 97% of the population is in play. But if we think that all of the innovation is happening in those two buckets, in those two areas of the country, that's where a lot of the major media is talking about innovation, but more than 97% of the country does not live in San Francisco or New York. So let's start talking about how we could drive innovation in those communities. Thanks.
I have one. Good morning, everybody. My name is Paul Parkhil. So I actually want to kind of bridge the strong city, weak city conversation in keeping with our new mayor's theme and talk about a tale of two cities. I am the director, as I said, of a new organization called Spaceworks, which was created by the Department of Cultural Affairs in New York City to develop affordable workspace for artists. There has been, I think, a growing crisis of affordability all across the city. I think you're familiar with it here too, but particularly for groups like artists who tend not to have steady income streams. There, I think, is an acknowledgement that there is some risk that if New York City didn't do something proactive about the situation, New York would become a place, I think nobody's concerned that it will be a place where art is not performed or exhibited, but that it will become a place where it is not made. So Spaceworks was really an effort to marry city capital dollars with city real estate assets, and to some extent private real estate assets, to develop a citywide infrastructure of affordable long-term workspace for artists. It is in stark contrast, I think, to the last organization I worked for, which is called the Greenpoint Manufacturing and Design Center, which was started in the early 90s around a building in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. It was a 360,000 square foot building that the organization bought from the city for $1 because the city didn't think that there was any other market for the building. So the spread, I think, in talking about sort of what the future of cities like Detroit or St. Louis or Cleveland are, I think it's interesting to see sort of the really compressed changes in a city like New York, and I think it really applies to New York generally. So just a little bit more about Spaceworks. We are currently working on 4 public projects. There are 2 library sites in the Brooklyn Public Library system that we're building both visual art studios and rehearsal spaces in. We're also working on a former school building on Governor's Island, which will be approximately 45 visual art studios and 2 rehearsal spaces. And we're also looking at a building in Brooklyn Bridge Park. These are all pretty straightforward real estate deals. They're long-term licenses that we're signing with city-owned property and then investing city capital in. We've also done a couple of pilot projects, one in Queens and the other in Brooklyn. One is a rehearsal space and one is a visual arts space. They're designed to kind of pilot our model and create intake systems that will allow us to kind of function when we scale up. We're also looking at larger projects in the Bronx and hoping to kind of diversify development sources. So we're looking at a 35,000 square foot building in the Bronx that we hope will be a kind of mixed-use arts campus in some ways. We're hoping to use new markets and historic tax credits and potentially sort of diversify the uses so that it's not just workspace but also space for small arts organizations. One of the things that I think is critical to emphasize is that artists, I think, have traditionally, and I think everybody acknowledges this at this point, served as a kind of transitional force in city neighborhoods, that there is a tendency for artists to move into cheap neighborhoods, affect some kind of change, excuse me, some kind of change often that turns into, I think, what everybody thinks of as gentrification, and then not be able to afford to stay in the neighborhoods anymore. We've seen it. I think the neighborhood we're in right now is probably one example of that. I think in New York there are a bunch of neighborhoods. Williamsburg is, I mean, it started really with Soho in the 70s and 80s, and then the Lower East Side, and then Williamsburg and Greenpoint, and now Bushwick, and to some extent Bed-Stuy. So one of the things that we're trying to do at Spaceworks is really to try to shift the paradigm so that we're really focused on long-term workspace, long-term neighborhood development, really, so that artists cease to be these kind of involuntary agents of neighborhood change and become sort of longer-term community assets. And so we're looking at really long-term workspaces that will allow artists to develop relationships with neighborhoods, to really create stability within neighborhoods rather than simply to sort of stir things up, make neighborhoods cool, and then sort of move on to the next neighborhood. In New York, we really don't have many more neighborhoods to move into. So it's funny also, I mean, one of the constant refrains in New York these days is that all of the artists are moving to Philadelphia or Detroit, or actually weirdly Berlin. Berlin seems to be the kind of outlier destination for artists. I don't know if the same conversation is happening in other cities. I also wanted to say, you know, getting back to GMDC, and I know David Ehrenberg from the Brooklyn Navy Yard is here. It's a similar kind of model. You know, there is also, I think, there are very interesting examples of light manufacturing. Whether or not they're incubators, I think, is an open question. Often they're again, sort of longer-term developments, and so they're not really designed to bring people in and then graduate them out. But I think sort of really emphasizing stable space for small manufacturers has been enormously successful in cities like New York, and continues to be. And I think Brooklyn has become, in some ways, sort of synonymous with this idea of people are calling it the maker movement now. It seems a little twee to me, but I think it's small manufacturing, I think, is a really important part of the economy and can continue to be. And I think if you cultivate that sector, I think it really is on a continuum with the arts. So a lot of the folks who we saw at GMDC were artists who had come up with a business model, sort of built it up into something, and then weren't necessarily doing fine arts anymore, but it was still a creative business. And so I think there are a lot opportunities there for sort of pushing that model and thinking of it really as industry. You know, I think it shouldn't just be reduced to a maker movement. It really is about creating stuff. So I'll leave it at that, and we can get into more at the question and answer.
I have nothing to say. And I'll make it short. But I think I'm here. My background mostly is urban planning on a macro scale. But I think two things. Let me talk about the seaport itself. And then, Nicole, you brought up a very, very good point. Coming from an architectural background, I'd like to start with that, this building. And Kairos, you remember this more than anyone. When we were sitting there and we were talking about what is innovation when you brought this up. And Nicole was with Hasina Associates, the architect who did this. And I remember many meetings sitting there saying, what the heck does innovation mean? You know, so of course I go to, you know, the dictionary and the thesaurus, and that's where we started. But you put together that brochure, you remember? It's an excellent brochure as what is the pieces, the physical pieces of it. Being, again, an architect, first thing I asked was, you know, I'll give you a budget, but I need a program. And half of our, working with the BRA, working with the architect and other consultants, and CIC, who was fantastic, who know the game of this, is developing the program for this building. And I think we got it about 85% right. I wish it cost $4.5 million, but, sorry, Kairos, but we won't get into that. But the innovative financing of this building is unbelievable. I mean, the flexibility with the city, the flexibility with CIC, the flexibility with our big partner, Morgan Stanley. I think it's a unique thing that should be put down of how to do it in a private-public partnership. That being said, let me just spend some time in Seaport. We're a very small organization. My background's almost 40 years in development, coming from an architectural firm before that. I was in New York for 15 years. And in New York City, and the reason you touched, Paul, on some good stuff, New York City, the way we developed areas then, back in the 70s and 80s, was, an example is 626th Avenue. It was with Tishman Speyer Properties. We got that piece of building, it's the old Cooper Siegel department store. It was a wreck. It was a warehouse and a wine storage facility. That area down in 18th and 19th Street was a dump. It was a terrible, terrible area. We went and developed it sort of as an afterthought. We got in Bed Bath & Beyond, is our main flagship store. We put 3 levels of retail in there. Then we got the Gap Northeast headquarters in there. And if you go down to that area, 18th, 19th, 6th Avenue, 7th Avenue, you'll find that that area is absolutely fantastic right now. I just wish we owned more land down there. From there, we went down to 375 Hudson Street, another area which is all Trinity Property, who's the biggest real estate owner in New York City. We developed 375 Hudson Street, an office building. That was a catalyst of bringing that whole area back. So why I say this is that this is an area, Boston is not a big city. It's a small town, but it's very urban. And it's very important that whatever you do, innovation is extremely important, but that you make a place that is fun to live in, to work in, and to play in. And this is going to be an absolutely unique area because it's very small. We have 26 acres of, I think, about 100 acres, this area, about 100 acres. 200. And in about another 5 years, this is going to be the place to live. The architect that's working with us on a large project at Frisco's down here, a small little restaurant area. That is the hottest place in Boston. I would never have guessed it. But it's extremely important that whatever you develop and where you develop it as a planned, balanced community. You just can't go into an old area and put in something, an innovation center like this. We, through negotiations with the city, what they did was they gave us 2 million square feet of development, and we gave them some infrastructure, we gave them the innovation center. Was it a tough negotiation? Yeah. Was it all private equity? Yeah. Morgan Stanley, we had a lot of convincing to do, but I think it was fair. I think you're going to get out of this place a beautiful area with a lot of open space. There's going to be residential people here where the younger, the 30 to 35-year-olds are going to live, work, and play. We're doing the same thing out for United Technologies in LA, in Warner Center. There's a 46-acre piece, which used to be a factory. We're turning it into an urban area. So there's 2 things I'll leave you with, and then I'll turn it over to Kairos. One is, make sure when you plan something that you look at the entire environment. I mean, Brooklyn, where my niece lives, is beautiful because Ratner developed an area. That is the hottest area I know of in the world right now. Brooklyn is fantastic. But you've got to develop the place and to develop an area which is fun to be with. The other is you have to balance it with the uses. And we have found that the last 3 years have been tough. The 3 years going forward it's going to be amazing around here. But let me leave you with that, Kairos.
Thank you. We have half an hour, so what I'd like to do is actually, in hearing what the presenters all talked about, I think I'd like to try to start a conversation about the difference between sufficient condition and necessary conditions for either innovation districts or space. Because I think all of us described an experience that was successful, but for every successful innovation district in Boston or any city, there are probably 25 in graveyards that didn't take off. You know, we look back in history and say, well, it's so obvious that Soho became what it became because of the colonization of the artists and so on. Same with Fort Point. But think of all the other places that artists tried to colonize that didn't work. And I would say, what, in your opinion, I mean, Travis, what took you to that specific location in St. Louis? What was it, and what was the, let's say, the sufficient condition? Because if you have sufficient, I would say, the kind of community and the we call it vibe, right? I don't know what it is because I'm not one of the really techie people, but you know it when you know it when you get there. There's what you talk about in terms of authenticity. How, you know, did you have to create that? Was it already there? I mean, I think the same question with Paul. You know, city-owned assets, not necessarily in the right place. I mean, we own some assets down in some neighborhoods that could use a revitalization. But, you know, we're confronted by neighbors coming, you know, we go out to different parts of the community, and they say, why don't you create an innovation corridor here, the same thing that you did there over in South Boston? And and maybe the answer is, well, you know, it's not innovation here. It's something else. So why don't you elaborate a little bit? Because I think the question of this is where what comes first in a way, and what are some of the things that can you turn a bunch of necessary sort of assets and conditions into sufficient conditions?
So for the Helix Center, our biotech incubator that's near Monsanto and Bridge Park and the Danforth Center, it's also out in the county. It's in the suburbs, and we found that, you know, the folks that we were attracting to that area weren't the 22, 23, sub-30 folks. They were the Pfizer employees that got laid off. They were the PhDs, the scientists mid-career that said, you know what, I have a golden parachute, this is my opportunity, I have friends, I have colleagues, and I have a Rolodex of business leads that I can go and leverage and start generating sales for this product, service, or solution to market right now. And they weren't interested in moving down to a downtown core with a lot of great restaurants or anything along those lines. They were unemployed, they had a cardboard box, and they wanted to become gainfully employed again and have more control over their career. And so creating the biotech hub in that space at that time matched up with the fact that there were researchers that were there. Monsanto was across the street. Monsanto Ventures was in the same building. There were a lot of opportunities, and there were great school systems. St. Louis has really good schools and some really bad schools. And a lot of these folks had school-age children, and so they wanted to make sure that if there was a downturn, that at least their kids were going to still be in a good school. Now, if we look at two other pockets in St. Louis, if we look at the downtown corridor, Washington Avenue, that was rehabbed probably a lot of revitalization in the last 7 years, 5 to 7 years, that was due to historic tax credits that allowed for a lot of the buildings to be rehabbed in an affordable way. And now that's becoming a hub and a tech hub for a lot of our early stage tech startups. Those are the sub 25-year-olds because there's a nightlife there, there's loft living, there's density, there's a program called Arch Grants, which is very much like Startup Chile, where they offer 20 companies $50,000 non-dilutable cash to locate their business in a hub in one building. And so that's a way to create that density instantly. And then if we look at what the next, and what I'm probably most excited about, even though it's I guess could be considered competition, but I've got a global perspective in St. Louis. When I look at what's going on in the Cortex corridor and CIC coming into town and really helping build out what's going on there, that started really as another biotech hub because WashU and the medical schools are right around the corner. It's moving beyond just biotech and really creating just an overall innovation center. CIC is going to play a key role in that, but there's other assets like good living, good restaurants, great scotch. All those things are nearby, and that really helps.
So you've, again, listed a bunch of things that make all rational. But it's a little bit like your description with your wife, or your now wife. What emotionally made you leave California to go? What was it? I mean, you could rationalize all of it.
Okay,
but
so
why didn't you choose Detroit?
So that's a very easy question. So I was running the water tech incubator in California, and a lot of things surfaced. I was doing some best practice research, and things in St. Louis popped up of best practices when you're focusing on a niche or a specific industry. And so I flew to St. Louis to visit and set up a bunch of meetings, and a lot of communities talk about collaboration. But that was the first community I had ever been in where the collaboration was, everybody was breathing it, everybody was playing off of the same script, and I talked to a variety of organizations. And I had no intention of moving there. I really wanted to just steal best practices and apply them because people don't share in California like they should when you're looking at industry, sharing within industries. And so the nature of collaboration, the sincerity, and just the economics of St. Louis versus California also made a lot of sense. It just really drew me there. And so that was November of 2011. We got back on a plane. I turned to my fiance and I said, hey, if you ever wanted to move to St. Louis, let's do it. January of 2012, we packed up our house and didn't have jobs. We just moved to St. Louis. I tell people it was better to be unemployed in St. Louis than gainfully employed in California. And that was because of purely the aesthetic of St. Louis. You didn't need anything tangible to hold on to, even though I could rattle off the tangible. You were able to go there and experience innovation in these different pockets, urban, suburban, and up and coming.
That's if being sharing and all of those was the most important criteria, then Boston probably in a conventional wisdom would fail, right? I would say one thing, that when the mayor started to, our mayor, Mayor Menino, started to learn more about the startup community, one thing he said that struck him most was that the innovation and startup community is naturally more collaborative than all the traditional economy that he was familiar with. And so it was something new to him. And I think this is really, it's one of those ingredients that perhaps you can't create. I mean, it has to be authentic to the place.
It's zeitgeisty.
Yeah. Now, Paul, I think I'd like to turn to you because you were developing, in some cases, pre-existing assets. Was it always true that those all did, in fact, was like honey that drew bees and succeeded? Or were there differences in, again, sort of like, what were some of the ingredients that would make something succeed versus fail?
So we're still very early in our process, so I will tell you in 5 years what worked really well and what didn't. We have been very opportunistic about what's available, and I think it's a really interesting question for us because we are really a community development entity, not a cultural entity, and we are interested not just in creating space for artists, but also in community development and neighborhood development. So, there are certain sites that we have. We're working the Williamsburg Library. It's kind of a no-brainer. I don't think we're going to have any demand issues. So there are very established arts communities in certain pockets of New York, especially in Brooklyn. But we're also trying to have a citywide impact. And so, for example, this project that I mentioned in the Bronx is in the Fordham section of the Bronx. It's not in the South Bronx, it's right in the middle. And we've struggled with what the demand is there and sort of whether it makes sense to do an arts-related project in the middle of the Bronx. We're coming to the conclusion, I think, that the answer is yes, in part because we really are invested in the Bronx as and trying to bring the audience there. But I don't think, so we are, to some extent, following the market, but to some extent kind of trying to push the market into neighborhoods that I think could really benefit from it. We also have a project on Governor's Island, as I mentioned, which has serious access issues. The ferry stops running at 6 p.m. So there are all kinds of other, when you work, I think, especially these days with city-owned property, you kind of take what you can get. It's not 1990. There aren't 10,000, in-rim properties. So I think it's across the board. It's always nice to be able to kind of, find the market naturally, but I think it's also important to push the market and sort of see what you can create.
So Nicole, I mean, you already talked about, and Charles talked also about the fact that we didn't know what was necessary in this building. Now that it's opened, is it because of Gather and Brew that this thing works? Or what would you say is the most important ingredient that makes this space so far successful?
Yeah, that's exactly. Thank you, Rand. You answered that question. No, I think, you know, when I talk about I've talked about this space a lot. I've given a lot of tours, and we've had delegations come from all over the country, all over the world to see what we're doing here. And the way that I've always talked about this building to those groups as an innovation space, why it's different, is if you look around Boston and Cambridge in particular, but many other cities, there are lots and lots and lots of innovation spaces, lots and lots of them. But very often they are like up on the 4th floor or the 14th floor. And once you get into that space, it's open, it's collaborative, it's supportive, everybody's introducing you to everybody else. But sometimes it's a little hard to find the front door. And you have to go through a security guard, you have to go through an elevator bank, you have to know what's there to find it, or have someone bring you. And the positioning of this building is really critically different. It's a little building, it's has a weird shape. It has a civic presence on the street. The door is open all the time. And the restaurant and the coffee shop play a real role in reinforcing all of that by saying, you know, come in and grab a coffee and kind of see what's going on here. I think that's the critical difference. And that's why we haven't advertised. We haven't put out a marketing campaign around like doing events at this building, you know, and maybe we will if now I'm running it and I have to actually make it, you know, sustainable. And so we'll see what happens on that. But anyway, it's been inbound because it's an invitation. I think it comes from that same place of extending a welcome in the best way we know how in an urban context, without being prescriptive about what's going to happen here, without saying you are the right person specifically or you are the right person. Let's look at this as a place that is going to be supportive for the type of stuff that we know that these people are going to want to do, and then let's put it in the most kind of obvious location that they might either stumble into it or be curious about it. And even if you've never heard the word innovation before, you could walk in the door and ask a question about what's happening here.
You know, just as a little anecdote, once we got the developer to, you know, graciously donate the resources to build the building, the big question actually is this a building that we should be running, we, the government, should be running? And we're the economic development agency, and again, the conventional wisdom for the kind of work we were doing was that we would take over it. And in fact, the negotiations initially was that we would be the tenant. Now, I think we had the good sense to say that if we turn this into more like, now this is a kind of 21st century gathering space that would sort of be a different kind of public library. I think Nicole already mentioned it. But we didn't want librarians or traditional librarians to run it. And so again, this was a piece of good luck. Cambridge Innovation Center was looking to expand from being an office provider, like say incubator type, to a convener. And so there was another sort of stroke of good luck that we had. But I will tell you that everything about this building was against the instincts of us, and certainly against the instincts of Charlie, which I would like to ask now that you were forced to invest in something like this. You know, in hindsight, what do you say? Because I think that in a way, this is the kind of thing that never would come to pass in a private development unless you were asked or made to do it. But tell us a little bit about the value of something like this and the value of the kind of community and activity that goes in on this kind of building.
We weren't forced. We traded with you, right? I think the funding of this, which I don't even know this, but I'm going to make a statement, it might be true, is probably this whole seaport thing. Private equity working with the city in investment. You know, there really are no government funds here, and that was good.
Well, not entirely true.
Yeah, I know. Not in this building. I don't mean in this building. I mean in Seaport, right? I mean in Seaport. And Tim is here. Hi, Tim. But I think what we thought this was good for, and John Hines, my boss and the CEO of my company, I mean, we designed this thing 50 times, and it's a problem. It's not a problem. It was a challenge to work with Morgan Stanley, who is a large-scale real estate developer, coming in and saying, look, I need $5 million to build a building. And they said, what, are you absolutely crazy? But you have to realize what this place was 5 years ago. before Vertex. There was a building over here by Fallon who was a gutsy developer, and he put up this building in the middle of nowhere. This was a big parking lot. It was terrible. I mean, I take mass transit, but no, but it was a big, big parking lot. And I think what we looked at it was, and what the tilting point was, we said to Morgan Stanley, look, we need to make this place active, we need people, we need it so that when another developer comes to look at B and C, which is these two properties here, or G, which is another property here, which is going to be built, they know that there's people here and there's activity. Right. And we had this area over here in Seaport, which was not part of Boston. We are the link, trying to link it to the city. So I think it was, they finally realized is, yes, it's worth the input, and it also is working with BRA. It helped in the whole overall design of the building.
You know, I liken, Charles is very gracious about the fact that they were not struggling with us. I would say
I'll
that
see you guys after.
if you were a retailer, you know, this was the flat screen TV discounted below cost to get all of the other things that you would get people to come in to buy. So anyway, I think we touched on a few themes. We have 15 minutes. I'd like to open it up for people for questions for the panelists. Yes.